I'm Beth. I am a reader and graphic designer based in Cleveland, Ohio, and I recently went on vacation. Our first stop was Bookbug in Kalamazoo, Michigan. This is an indie bookstore that features a lot of emergent authors and in their own voices. They also have a really nice coffee shop as part of their building, and I thought that the atmosphere was really relaxing. I spent several hours browsing there. They had a really awesome selection of new books. They had them laid out on tables for you to browse, as well as shelving, and then there were staff picks. I love looking at those shelves in particular when I visit a bookstore to see what the local book clubs are reading, and also some of the favorite picks of the bookstore staff. The next bookstore that we checked out was Kazoo Books. This is a used and new bookstore, and it is set in two houses that are neighboring one another, so you can cross the little walkway from one house to the other, and there are several floors and rooms of books to browse. They had their popular titles, new releases, contemporary fiction and fantasy, primarily in the first building that I went into, and then over in the annex they had a really bright and sunny children's room, and in the basement were a little bit more fantasy and sci-fi. I happened to come across a table that had almost the entire series of The Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan. Thought it was really cool to see all of the covers there at one time. We were staying in Traverse City, Michigan, and I was able to visit Brilliant Books, which is in the little touristy downtown area of Traverse City. There were definitely a lot of common books in the new release section at each store, but that was cool to see the variation in each of the shops that I visited. On our drive home, we stopped in Ann Arbor, Michigan. We were able to check out independent bookstore Literati, which is located in downtown Ann Arbor, Michigan. I have never seen a bookstore that had so many shelf cards, you know, the little cards that have an employee review to encourage you to check it out. There were so many of those, and it felt very much like what I've seen of European bookstores. It's a smaller space, but there's so many shelves. Whether you're searching for that last minute summer mood read, or you're looking for a book that makes it feel like fall, I think that you're gonna find some great recommendations in this stack. I want to share with you what I think is going to be one of my favorite fantasy books of the year, and I'm so glad that I took Patrick Leo up on his recommendation and read this one. It is The Will of the Many by James Islington, and I love this book. This book has a sort of ancient Roman setting, but the technology is more futuristic, and it has a magic system that is based on will. And yes, I'm talking about a literal willpower. The current structure of the government and society in this novel is ranked based on those who surrender their will regularly, who are on the bottom, and moving upward, those who receive will from other people, all the way up to the elite classes who are giving no will but receiving all of the will. So each of those levels of the pyramid is distinguished by the number of people who are essentially giving them their power. If this doesn't make sense to you, don't worry. You don't have to understand it from my explanation. The world building is really skillfully done. It helps you understand the society and the stakes at play as you progress through the story without bogging down the plot. In this story, we're following the main character of Viz. He's offered an escape from his part-time job as a prison guard and full-time orphan in exchange for his services as a spy. If he agrees, he will be adopted by a wealthy man named Telemus. Telemus needs a capable young person like Viz who can advance through the ranks of this mysterious school that claims to be preparing its privileged students for roles in military, religion, and the Senate. But for the few students that make it to graduation, even fewer students make it out alive. While Viz suspects that the vigorous training and study have hidden motives that further advance the hierarchy, he is also closely guarding his true identity, one that could make him the hierarchy's greatest threat. I loved my time in this book. It's often tense, dark, and mysterious, but there are also some comforting human moments. In the basement of this story's house, we have an oppressive government and a foreboding secret society-like plot within a magic school setting. But in the living room, there are some buddy friendships that form that provide a cozy little fireplace within a setting that is otherwise cold and heavy with suspicion and competition. Another reason you might want to pick this one up is if you like single-player role-playing games that have a wide world to explore, missions to accomplish, side quests, etc. I think you're really gonna like the main character narrative voice. It feels a lot like that. There are fight scenes, there's training montages, there's side quest discovery locations that Viz has to visit and acquire information. Even in conversations, there's a lot of tension and subterfuge at play. All things that Viz has to get just right, or he could lose everything. And as a reader, you end up hanging on every word, and I was groaning at all of the near misses. I officially know what it feels like to have read the first book in a really good fantasy series and be hanging until the next book is out. Since this one just came out in May, I'm not sure when we can expect the next installment. As I wait, I will probably pick up the Lycanus trilogy and give that a read. The other book that I recently finished, which I talked about at length in this video, is Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy. And while I gave a lot of non-spoilery content in that video so that if you're thinking about reading it, you'll get enough information to know whether that's a book for you, I did want to give a little bit more of a spoilery review in this video so that if you have read it, we can kind of relate together about the things that we loved. And if you want to go ahead and skip to the next part of the video, I have chapters below in the description and you can go ahead and do that. So I mentioned in my other video that this book is about relationships. One of the things that I found really interesting and was thinking about during my time reading was the juxtaposition between Kitty and Levin's marriage and Anna and Vronsky's relationship. Whereas Kitty and Levin's relationship was a pretty healthy one, Anna and Vronsky's was pretty blatantly unhealthy. Yeah, Anna and Vronsky have some romantic lines about their passion for one another, but their willingness to sacrifice literally anything in order to be together kind of comes true, and they ended up burning the relationship in the process of that sacrifice. Everything that they were trying to do in order to preserve that excitement and initial attraction of their relationship ended up stunting their relationship and keeping it from growth. Anna and Vronsky both wanted to be happy together. There's a lot of lines about their desire for happiness, but they were hiding what hurt them and they weren't communicating their actual wishes and fears. So they really didn't have any sort of room to grow into a healthy relationship. They were trying to pretend their way backward, and in the process it really destroyed them as people. Whereas on the other side we have Kitty and Levin, who had some really good examples of communication from their early relationship, even in the description of their eye contact and how they could tell what the other person was feeling without saying words, but they also verbally communicated what they were feeling and thinking, even if they didn't think the other person was going to receive that well. And they encountered situations of jealousy, someone flirted with their spouse, they needed to move back from the city to their home in the country because life in Moscow was really affecting their relationship, their personal health, and their finances. So we have a really good picture on one side of what it means to be in a safe and healthy relationship where there is a lot of trust and both are seeking the good of the other person, and in one that is selfish, shaky, and harmful. Another theme that I thought was really interesting that just kind of shows up in a little bit of a vignette is when Anna and Vronsky visit the home of a local painter. They brought with them another friend who had spoken really negatively about the artist's work, but they decided they were going to go ahead and check it out for themselves anyway. And in this scene, we get to see how the painter, even though he doesn't necessarily respect his visitors, he really is hanging on what they're going to say about his work to see if they take an entirely different meaning out of the art that he's created, if they complement it in a way that's going to make it mean even more to him. And that just felt so relatable to me. We're really craving some affirmation from people about the work that we do, but in the end you really just need to be able to enjoy it for yourself, and the value of it isn't based on other people's opinion of it. Especially for the late master painters, the value lies in the person that made it. It isn't specifically that one painting that we value anymore. It is their entire career, their entire life of work that we are admiring. So it was a really good reminder to take the value and find the meaning in what you're making now and not rely on other people to declare a value over that. So yeah, those were just a few things that I really enjoyed from my time in Anna Karenina. I ended up giving that one 5 stars. and I'm really excited to read War and Peace. I plan to pick up the edition of that book that uses the same translators as my edition of Anna Karenina because I really enjoyed my time with the choice of language and I felt it was really an approachable read. So speaking of painting, the next book that I read was Yumi and the Nightmare Painter by Brandon Sanderson. This is the third of his secret projects. It's very different from the other two books, except we do still have the main character of Hoyd, who was the narrator for our time in Trust of the Emerald Sea. This one, I have to say, was a little bit of a letdown for me. I still think that Trust of the Emerald Sea is my favorite of the three thus far. This one had a lot of fun elements to it. If you like anime, if you like manga, if you like Japanese art style, I think you will really appreciate this one. Painter glanced at her and let out a long breath. "Thanks," he whispered. "But you're right about me. It's hard sometimes, you know? Keeping on doing the same thing every day, feeling like you're getting nowhere." He pointed at the fire escape, a metal lattice that ran up alongside the building. She squinted and barely made out a trail of smoke coming off one of the metal corners on the second story. They started upward. "In school," he whispered to her, "the teachers always talked about the importance of our job. They'd preach about the meaning of art, about theory. They said painting was about passion and the whims of creativity. They teach us we're supposed to see the shape of the nightmare and paint that. Then you get into the real world and find it's hard to be creative like that every moment. You realize they didn't teach you important things like how to work when you don't feel passion or when the whims of creativity aren't striking you. What then? What good is theory when you need to feed yourself? In the real world, you realize you can do your job by making the same thing again and again. Bamboo captures nightmares just fine, whatever they say. All of those high-minded aspirations from school fade before the truth, Yumi, that sometimes it's just a job." That was really meaningful to me because I have a creative job and sometimes it feels like I can just make the same thing over and over again and it's fine. And sometimes like that is enough to do the same thing over and over again. But then as a creative person, like you want to try to have a unique solution for something. You want to try new things. And if you don't feel like you have the time for it or the expectation is production and result and not process, that can really mess with you because it's about your output and not your experience, and you can end up spending your life just like making the same things over and over again. Especially this year, the fact that this book came out this year in the midst of AI really taking off and there are protests happening about how AI should be limited so that it's not taking over creative roles. A lot of the jobs that have so much art and craft and dedication involved, I think that is such an important conversation. That is such a main part of this story, our desire to be seen as human people, and the work that we do to matter. That makes this book all the more special to me. All that being said, it was not my favorite of the Secret Project novels so far, and I had some kind of like discomfort with the boy-girl relationship development in this book. I just thought that it was a little clunky. I haven't read anything else from Brandon Sanderson outside of the Secret Projects though, so I couldn't tell you if that's consistent for him or if that's something that he just struggled with in particular with this story. You'll have to let me know in the comments. I just thought it could have been a little bit stronger and it felt kind of awkward, but part of that wasn't intentional, I'm sure. So yeah, this one feels a lot more like a young adult novel to me instead of just reading it as a story at surface level. The meaning is kind of like right there, like a pile of rocks. Did you read this one? Let me know what you thought. I gave it 4 stars, so it's not 5 stars, but it's a 4-star read for sure. The next book that I read, I was considering taking with me on vacation because it is set in Michigan. In fact, not too far from Traverse City, which is where I stayed for most of the week. But this is Tom Lake by Ann Patchett. This story is a historical fiction. This is a contemporary fiction, but we get flashbacks to the past. It's a mother who's telling the story of her early years getting into acting and her summers at a theater camp in Tom Lake, Michigan. She talks about relationships that she had over the summers and where they ended up bringing her in life and how she ended up having her daughters and living with them on a cherry farm. So because we were headed to Michigan, I actually decided I wanted to read this one ahead of time and then just kind of enjoy being in that setting. This one I would probably give 3.5 stars. The cemetery is the highest point on the property and would have been the logical site for a house. The way it overlooks the trees and the barn and all the way to the edge of the lake. But those first settlers gave the best land to their dead. The very first, a 2-year-old named Mary. One by one, they followed her up the hill until 29 of them were resting beneath the mossy slabs, and there they wait for us to join them. That's what life was like back in the day. You buried your children, your husband, your parents right there on the farm. They had never been anywhere else. They had never wanted to be anywhere else. The main character, Laura, has been cast as the young girl in the play Our Town several times throughout her life, and that is a recurring theme in this book. And I would say if you haven't read the play or watched the film adaptation, I would highly recommend you do that before you give this one a read. It'll just help you keep track of which characters they're talking about, and I don't know, it'll just add to your experience. You don't have to, but it would be a good idea. This one had a lot of beautiful descriptions of nature, but primarily the descriptions are about the people, and I really enjoy that about it. It has a lot to say about the farming life and just the hardship and joy, how our past relationships contribute to the people that we are today. This is a really good summer book, but even in like the beginnings of fall, I think it would be a good one to read. It was a Reese's book club pick too. I know it's really popular right now, so if you want to give it a read, you can probably find a copy at your local library. This would be a great one to read as we're winding out of summer and emerging into fall. And it also has a audiobook that is narrated by Meryl Streep. I ended up flying through this book physically, but I was listening to the audiobook at times, and that was also a really sweet experience to hear Meryl Streep's voice as the main character of this novel, so I would recommend either way. The first book that I was reading on my vacation was Travels with Charley in Search of America by John Steinbeck. This is just the perfect US road trip book, and I didn't know that that existed, but especially if you're going up north. We were going from Ohio to Michigan, as I mentioned, and at the early part of his journey, that is exactly what Steinbeck is doing. He is going from the East Coast to the West Coast, and then he goes down south through California to Texas, and then back up to his home. So on a road trip, it felt very relatable to be reading from his thoughts. He had a special truck built that had sort of a camper attachment in the back, and he wanted to get back to having conversations with average people and his travels and collecting some of their stories, as well as seeing more of the United States. So that is what his road trip was about, and he happened to take along with him his poodle, Charley. Almost on crossing the Ohio line, it seemed to me that people were more open and more outgoing. The waitress in a roadside stand said good morning before I had a chance to, discussed breakfast as though she liked the idea, spoke with enthusiasm about the weather, sometimes even offered some information about herself without my delving. Strangers talked freely to one another without caution. I had forgotten how rich and beautiful is the countryside, the deep topsoil, the wealth of great trees, the lake country of Michigan handsome as well-made women, and dressed and jeweled. It seemed to me the earth was generous and outgoing here in the heartland, and perhaps the people took a cue from it. Just like the author, I did get a little fatigued toward the 3/4 mark of the book, which is when he's feeling like he can't absorb anymore and he needs to go home. And I kind of felt that way too. I felt like I didn't want to read anymore. I finished it. Overall, I would give this one 3.5 stars. The other book that I read on my trip was Anxious People by Frederick Bachman. This was a very absorbing story. It was a lot of quirky characters, a really great amount of humor, but also just so many good lines. If you are feeling anxious about anything, this book is going to call that out and also give you some comfort. So This was kind of a zany story, and if you're not a fan of books where you are kind of getting the same story or the same situation from different perspectives, you might not like this one as much, but I think that the different characters more than make up for that. So you're gonna get insight around the same incident, which is a bank robbery and a hostage situation. That's at the center of this plot, but you're going to get it from the perspective of witness interviews at the police station, and there are transcripts of those interviews, and then you're going to get insight from the bank robber themselves, and then it's all going to come together by the time you get to the end of the book. I love Frederick Bachman. He is definitely one of my favorite authors, and the way that he writes people and their hopes and fears and their overcoming is just really delightful. So I ended up giving this one 4 stars. This next book is a great one if you are looking for an atmospheric fall read. It is called Spells for Forgetting by Adrienne Young. If I had to guess, it's probably set in October. The leaves have turned, there's a chill in the air, and there are a lot of thunderstorms even though the heat of the day is still occurring. This story has multi-POV, but our main character is Emery Blackwood. Emery has grown up on this island where 14 years ago, one of her closest friends, Lily, was found killed. And the circumstances were mysterious. They never found who actually did it, but the greatest weight of suspicion lay on her boyfriend at the time, August. August and his mother disappeared from the island, and despite Emery's efforts to trace them, she hasn't been able to find them. And it's been many years, but suddenly August is seen back on the island, and the town is generally not happy about his reappearance, and the emotions and suspicion that surrounded the murder and the burning of the island's main source of tourism, which is a famous apple orchard. All of that tragedy kind of comes back, and you realize that the town hasn't dealt with it yet. There are also themes of magic. The local townspeople clearly hiding something. It's going to be up to Emery to kind of investigate further for herself to find out what really happened that night 14 years ago and whether August is actually the culprit of Lily's murder. So it's a murder mystery, it's got very fall atmosphere, it's also sort of a magical realism story. Overall, I would say this one was probably a 3.5 star or 3.25 for me. You can kind of tell where the plot is going fairly early on in the book. If you're looking for something that's dark and spooky, I did read this in one day, so it's a very quick read. It's a lot more plot than character in my opinion, but it was very atmospheric. So those are the books that I recently read on my vacation and the bookstores that I got to visit. I'd love to know if you've been traveling this summer, if there are any bookstores that you loved or books that you've read in your travels that are inseparable from that time away now. As always, I hope that you're having a great reading month, and I always appreciate your recommendations and feedback in the comments below. I will see you in another video soon.